Hello, I'm Joanne Harris. Welcome back to 10 Things About Writing. Today I'm going to talk a little about point of view. Last time I talked about voice, and the two topics are linked, but they are not quite the same thing. One feeds into the other, if you like. And there are three basic points of view. This is the perspective, the angle from which you choose to tell your story. And I'm going to treat them separately because otherwise, I think it would make for an unwieldy, long tutorial. So I'm going to start with the third person because traditionally, third person storytelling used to be the most popular. It's no longer quite as popular as it was, but there are still plenty of stories told in the third person, and it has its advantages. Now, to me, there are several types of third person narrative. The third person can be either the omniscient narrator, the writer who knows everything, who is a kind of puppet master, manipulating all their characters. They know what they are, they know where they're going, they know what they're going to be doing, this kind of thing. This kind of narrative is traditional, but not as popular as it used to be. You tend to hear the distant third person in things like traditional fairy stories and in older literature. I think nowadays it's lost some element of popularity because people demand a closer connection with their characters than they used to. And the third person, when treated in that distant way, can sometimes feel a little cold. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, I'm getting there. Think of your narrative as delivering a story a bit like a movie delivers a story. Movies have the advantage of being able to use different camera angles for different scenes, but effectively your distant third person is a long shot. It shows an overview, it can set the scene, it can have multiple characters acting in the same shot without having to concentrate on one of them. It's very good for setting scenes. It's not always good for telling people stories, human stories, making that connection. Nowadays, we tend to use different kinds of narrative and we modify our third person point of view, sometimes taking it out to give a broader overview of what's going on, sometimes taking it in to look at individual characters and how they may be thinking, what they may be feeling. I'm going to give you a few examples because examples tend to help. This one's from Shirley Jackson. It's a story called The Good Wife. Now, Shirley Jackson often has quite a chilly, distant approach to storytelling anyway, but she is also very good at pulling out relevant details, making the reader aware of them. And this is why she's such a good handler of the third person. Mr. James Benjamin poured a second cup of coffee for himself, sighed, and reached across the table for the cream. "Genevieve," he said without troubling to turn, "has Mrs. Benjamin had her breakfast tray yet?" "She's still asleep, Mr. Benjamin. I went up 10 minutes ago." "Poor thing," said Mr. Benjamin, and helped himself to toast. He sighed again, discarded the newspaper as unworthy of notice, and was pleased to find that Genevieve was bringing in the mail. "Any letters for me?" he asked, more to contribute to some human communication and desire, even so low a one as desiring the mail, than to secure information that he might very well have in a minute. "Anything for me?" Genevieve was too well bred to turn over the letters, but she said, "It's all there, Mr. Benjamin," as though he might have suspected her of abstracting vital letters, about business perhaps, or from women. Now, this one's interesting because it starts off as an overview of two characters. Mr. Benjamin, who is already not coming across terribly well. We already know that he's a bit of a lazy character and that he's quite judgmental, and Genevieve, who's doing as she's told, who's bringing in his letters, but who's also having little thoughts of her own, little judgy thoughts, and you can kind of tell that the author has picked these out for notice without inhabiting Genevieve's mind or telling us what she's thinking. She's just hinted, and so that's a fairly distant, to me, third person narrative, but it's still got animation. It's still filled with life. you still feel that those two characters are beginning to emerge from this early narrative, and that they have something to say. I'm going to have a look at some closer third-person angles now, so that you can see how it works when an author zooms in. Quite often, authors will concentrate on different characters at different times in a book. George R.R. Martin does this all the time. He tends to allocate a section or a chapter to a character and to write entirely from their point of view, although not using the first person. And so you will get their thoughts and their feelings and their memories and the things that they particularly notice, and then he will move on to somebody else so that he can get multiple third-person points of view, so that he can have a level of omniscience still while zooming in from time to time on individuals. And this one is Ghost Story by Peter Straub, and he does much the same thing. In this story, he tends to have chapters which are seen particularly from the perspective of certain characters in order to understand what's happening to them. And this one is about John Jaffrey, and he said so at the beginning of the chapter so that the readers are not confused at all, and so that they have chance to adjust between the last character perspective and this one. And he's put a little pause, a chapter ending, so that effectively your camera can pull out a bit, give your readers a rest, because what you don't want is lots of frenzied head hopping and POV changing and this kind of thing, because it will eventually alienate your audience if you allow that to happen. So this one's entirely from John's perspective, but there's a little bit of intro into it, just so that we're not jumping straight from one character into another. The doctor, whose party it had been, woke out of a troubled sleep just at the time when Ricky Hawthorne and Sears James were beginning their walk across a field in the direction of what appeared to be several piles of dirty laundry. Moaning, Jaffrey looked around the bedroom. Everything appeared to be subtly altered, subtly wrong. Even the bare shoulder of Millie Sheehan, who slept on beside him, was somehow wrong. Millie's round shoulder looked insubstantial, like pink smoke floating in the air. This was true of the bedroom as a whole. The fading wallpaper, blue stripes and bluer roses, the table bearing neat piles of coins, a library book, The Making of a Surgeon, and a lamp, the doors and handles of the tall white cupboard opposite, his yesterday's grey striped suit and last evening's dinner jacket draped carelessly over a chair. It all seemed drained of several shades of colour, wispy as the interior of a cloud. In this room, at once familiar and unreal, he could not stay. So here you've got a shift of camera angle and you can see it happening. It's nicely done. This happens a lot, particularly in thrillers and horror and stories where the emotions are particularly engaged and you need to feel jeopardy for various characters. And this is what you're being expected to feel for this character, who is indeed in jeopardy. And we start off with this little character reminder that Sears James and Ricky Hawthorne are doing something else at the same time. The something else is a bit sinister. They're walking across this field in the snow. There's something that may or may not be dirty laundry. Full disclosure, it's really not dirty laundry. We know something sinister's going on, and then boom, in we are, looking not quite through Jaffrey's eyes, but certainly we're close to him, we're on his shoulder. We are seeing more or less exactly what he sees. And what he sees is slightly altered reality. It's profoundly disconcerting for him. Things don't seem to be entirely real to him. He can't stay. You can sense his tension and his dislocation. And you can also tell as a reader that something pretty bad's about to happen to him. So this is how Peter Straub is using different versions of the third person to bring you closer to the action, to take you slightly further away from the action, to bring you back into the action again, without necessarily using the first person voice. I'm going to give you one last example. It's from Christopher Fowler's book, The Victoria Vanishes. And this is something that a lot of thriller writers do. This is writing from the perspective of a minor character in order to bring you into the story. We will have different perspectives again through the book. She had 4.5 minutes left to live. She sat alone at the cramped bar of the Seven Stars and stared forlornly into her third empty glass of the evening, feeling invisible. The 400-year-old public house was tucked behind the Royal Courts of Justice. It had been simply furnished with a few small tables, wooden settles, and framed posters of old British courtroom movies. Miss Curtis had been coming here for years, ever since she had first become a legal secretary, but every time she walked through the door, she imagined her father's disapproval of her drinking alone in a London pub. It wasn't something a vicar's daughter should do. So here we have the victim. You're told straight away that it's the victim. You don't want to get too attached to her. But on the other hand, if you are going to write a victim and your readers don't care for her or have no insight at all into her background or her past, why would they care that she's a victim? And so what he's done, quite cleverly, he's informed you of who she is. Then he's pulled away, set the scene, the way he does so well, and talked about this pub. And then he zoomed back in on her and given her just a couple of details that you didn't know before. He's starting to engage the reader in this character, even though we know that the character is, at some point quite soon, about to die. So see how various authors have used this technique of moving in when you want to make a connection with a character. And obviously making a connection with a character is making a connection with a reader. You as the writer will be wanting to do that at different intervals, depending on how sympathetic you want the character to seem, but it's always useful to make reader connections because that way they will connect with your story. If they like your characters, if they're interested in what happens next to your characters, they will keep turning the page, which is what all of us would like them to do. Next time I'll be talking about first-person point of view. Tune in then.